In 2008, director Andrew Stanton gave the world a sensational adventure that took us into the great beyond.
In 2021, we try a limited release bourbon from one of our favorite brands.
The film is WALL-E.
The whiskey is Old Forester 150th Anniversary.
And we'll review them both. This is the
Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
Bob, I just love our opening. Like, we've been doing this for enough years now that I think I could just say that.
Yeah.
It just gets me pumped every time.
Listen, man, when we shout simultaneously in unison, the Film and Whiskey Podcast, every week, I get goosebumps, man.
Just little goosebumps, man. I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 2008 Pixar classic, WALL-E.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 255,642 aboard the Axiom. As always, weather's a balmy 72 degrees and sunny, and oh, hey, I see the ship's log is showing that today is our 700th anniversary of our 5-year cruise. Well, I'm sure our forefathers would be proud to know that 700 years later we'd be doing the exact same thing they were doing. So, be sure next mealtime to ask for your free Septuacentennial cupcake in a cup. Wow, look at that.
Brad, of all the Pixar movies that we have done or will do on this podcast, this is the one that I think I had circled and was most anticipating just for the conversation that I think is going to arise today. This is a movie that is kind of out of Pixar's general wheelhouse. It's a very different kind of movie. Critics love this movie. Audiences like this movie a lot, but I don't see a lot of like regular people who would claim WALL-E as their favorite Pixar movie. So there is kind of a divide there between the people who look at this movie as like a work of art and the people who just go in to, pay their $10 to sit in a nice, cool, air-conditioned theater and be entertained. So I'm really, really pumped for us to kind of parse out how we each feel about this movie.
Yeah, Bob, I'm not going to lie. We were texting about this, and you said, and I quote, "I've been interested in what you'd think of this movie for years." and I literally responded, we were talking about WALL-E, and I literally responded with WALL-E ? Because I was so confused why this is the movie that has kept you up at night, that my opinion has kept you up at night, wondering, man, what does Brad think about WALL-E?
It's like that meme template where the people are laying in bed next to each other. And the woman's like, I wonder if he's thinking about other girls. And it's just me there thinking, I wonder what Brad thinks about WALL-E.
Exactly. I was a little bit taken aback by that because I was like, I feel like this is a really like chill film. It's really pretty and like fun.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know what it was that kept you up at night thinking about what I think of WALL-E.
Well, I do think there are a number of angles that you could look at the movie from. And one of them is the filmmaking side of things, which we're obviously going to do. The first, I'd say, third to half of this movie is essentially a silent film. There is, quite literally almost no dialogue except for two robots kind of saying each other's names back and forth once in a while. And it's a really bold move by Pixar to do something like that. And I think critics latch onto that and they latch onto that filmmaking side of things. And they really put this movie up on a pedestal. And I think there's another way of looking at the movie, which is, unfortunately, I think kind of dependent on like where you fall politically in the United States, because this movie has a lot to do with the idea of climate change and pollution and things like that. And Brad, we don't really go into politics much on this podcast, but I'm more left of center. You're a little bit more right of center. And so I didn't know if you'd watch this movie and find it to be kind of like overbearing with themes that you interpreted as political. But I could honestly, even as a person who aligns more with like a left view of things, I could see how somebody could watch this movie and think that it is kind of a little bit overdone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. I think the interesting thing to me is that if we're jumping into the political side of things right away, I think that the biggest political statement that this movie makes is that the philosophy of capitalism is itself evil and leads to a bad end. And the reason I say the philosophy is because this time watching it, this is my second or third time watching it, I believe. I realized and I noticed that the humans in this movie are not the bad guys. Like when you look at the destruction that was wrought on the planet, the movie does not place the blame at the foot of humanity in general. Like every time you see a human interact in this movie, it's always in a positive manner. Wally bumps into him and helps push him back up onto the chair. And the guy's like, oh, hey, thanks, little buddy. I really appreciate that. And then he runs into this other woman and they form this little love connection and they're watching Eva and Wally fly through the air. And the way they portray humans is that if they were given an opportunity, they will be good. But it is capitalism that has sucked them down the drain into consumerism and destruction and destroying their planet. Do you think that's a fair take?
Yeah, man, I absolutely do. And I think that we're definitely going to get into some of this stuff on the back end of the episode. But before we get too far down the rabbit hole of the evils of consumerism, let's take a step back. Let's jump into Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. We know from your own admission, Brad, this is not your first time seeing this movie. But can you break down the plot of this film in less than 60 seconds for our listeners?
I think I'll be able to do it, Bob. Earth has been abandoned by humanity. It's overpolluted, overcrowded, overproduced goods. And so they leave a bunch of robots in charge of cleaning it up. And I would imagine a few thousand years later, there's one little robot left cleaning up all this trash. In the process of doing this, he finds a little green plant. He protects it and hides it with his stash of other stuff. And then a big old new fancy robot ship comes flying on in. It sends Eva to find any signs of life so that humanity come back. Wally falls in love with her. She gets the plant. They take it back to the main ship where all the humans are living. And then there's a battle because the ship's AI is basically trying to sabotage their movement back to Earth. But they make it.
I was going to say, I thought you were just going to end Brad Explains on a cliffhanger.
But you got to watch the movie, Bob.
To be continued. Will they survive the axiom? Find out next week.
You know that we don't do spoilers here on the Film and Whiskey podcast.
No. Never. All right, so let's talk Wall-E, Brad. I guess the best place to start is with the start of this film. And I want to kind of talk about this movie in its two halves, or its two main chunks.
Do you mean the start of the film, in the little brain cells of Andrew Stanton, the director?
Yes. From the time it was just a twinkle in his eye.
That's right.
No, I want to break this movie down into its kind of two halves, or its two chunks. And the first one being that 35-minute silent film at the beginning here. There's so much that we could dive into. I guess let's just kind of start with it taken as a whole, Brad. I'd love to hear your comments on kind of the audacity of Pixar to do something like this. I mean, we just talked about them a few weeks ago when we did Toy Story 2 and how you could tell even in the late 90s that they were adding little flourishes and details that they didn't have to do. And it was just clear evidence that they were going to be the studio that went above and beyond, that consistently challenged themselves to try new things and to perfect their craft. And I think this may have been, in a lot of ways, their most ambitious kind of challenge for themselves to that point. So I don't know, Brad, I'm sure you watched this movie closer to when it was released, and now you've watched it again. And having watched 200 or however many movies we've done on this podcast now in between, the filmmaking technique of that first 35 minutes, I just kind of want to hear your impressions of it.
Well, actually, Bob, the first time I ever saw this movie was 6 months ago.
Oh, there you go. Well, you've seen a lot of movies since then, Brad. So
many movies. I mean, a movie a week in 6 months. That's quite a few movies.
That's almost 30 movies.
Oh, Bob, you're doing a movie a day for a year, and I just don't know how you have time for your children. So
I don't. We've leased them out to others.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Is that something I can do? I'm a new parent. Can you fill me in on
man,
that?
You gotta make that money, bro.
I don't like where this is going at all. This Wall-E episode sure took a turn.
Consumerism at its finest, man.
Lease out your children so you can buy more stuff.
All right. First half of the movie. What'd you think?
Okay. So here's the deal. When I look at a movie like Wall-E, I think something that was going through the Pixar team's brain was this idea of like, what is the greatest challenge in animation? And I think that they probably honed in on something to the effect of like, why does art, and I'm speaking more of like paintings, drawings, sculptures, things you'd see in a museum. Why can art, or why does art like that draw emotion out of humans, right? Like that, that's the beauty of being at an art museum, is that you wander through this massive hall that's devoted to different people's life works. And you might not hit on 95% of the art, but there might be one painting that just captures you and moves you, and you could sit in front of it for hours, right? Or at least that's the ideal when people think about going to an art museum. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what Pixar was trying to hone in on was like, yes, there's a beauty to acting and vocal intonation and, Tom Hanks in Toy Story. Like there's an emotionality to his journey in Toy Story 2, because we just talked about that a few weeks ago. But for them, I feel like they were challenging themselves, saying, what if you took the acting out of it and we made a true piece of media visual art, like moving art that doesn't have to do with any voice acting or anything like that? How can we show emotion in a character that doesn't really speak? And not only show emotion, but get the audience to feel emotional with them. And so for me, I loved the opening of this movie. Like, it is beautiful. It's funny in parts. It's dramatic in other parts. Once again, you just see the Pixar team like flexing its muscles. Like the detail when Wall-E is chasing the little red dots and the ship begins to land and the rocks go flying everywhere and he starts chunking his way down into the ground to escape, and like all the little minute details of those scenes as the scene moves by so fast, it's beautiful. Like Pixar is hands down just so far and away beyond any other studio when it comes to like small, little, teeny tiny details that they can put on the screen. I just think that what they did was beautiful. And I think they accomplished their goal of creating a piece of living art that doesn't need acting to support it.
So here's what I'll say to everything you just said. I agree. And yet, for some reason, Wall-E, I'm going to out myself now because I think I'm going to have to unpack this as we go through the episode. Wall-E has always been one of those movies that I think at the end of the day, like when I'm doing my ranking of Pixar movies, is probably going to be lower on my list than people would expect it to be. And I think it's a really good movie, and I think it's obviously, like, from a filmmaking craft point of view, it's an incredibly well done movie. But I think it's a movie that I appreciate more than I enjoy. And I think that the kind of like first half versus second half of this movie really does demonstrate part of the reason for that. And I'll unpack it like this. I think that the first two movies where I really, really noticed a jump in the Pixar animation to like, wow, I don't think anything like this has ever been put on screen before, was Ratatouille and then this movie. You know, in Ratatouille, there was so much detail on the fur of those animals, and you could kind of see like when their little ears were up against light, you could see like the translucency, and you could see little like capillaries and veins, and it was like what are they doing? Pixar is just on a new level. And then this movie comes out, and especially like in the first half of the movie, when it's just Wall-E and Eve on Earth, it wasn't even like they were going for a somewhat realistic, convincing version of the world. It was like, we're going to do photorealism. Everything on this screen is going to look more like it was taken with a photo camera than it is something we created to be a cartoon. Like the level of detail on the metal and the rust and the layers of dust that are covering everything is like, it is insanely realistic. And then they go to space and everything kind of takes a turn into being a little more cartoony. You know what I mean? Like they show the humans and the humans still look like Pixar humans. And I think I've kind of struggled for a long time with this movie in that, like, I don't know if it wants to be something else that isn't a Pixar movie. Like, does it want to be a photorealistic piece of art, or does it want to be a kid's movie? And that's not to say that you can't be both of those things, but like watching the movie is kind of a metaphor for how I feel about the movie, where the first half is a completely different thing. And the second half is, okay, here, like, we're finally going to give you the Pixar movie you came to watch. And for me, the two halves of this movie never have really fully felt like they fit together. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, all the pieces of this movie for me have never quite felt like they totally fit together. Like, it's a well done movie. It's a good movie, but there's just something that keeps me from thinking that it's like great.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, it feels like the first half of the movie and a little bit of the space half, if you want to call it the Earth part and the space part. Like, the Earth part genuinely just has a patient, measured take on everything that's happening. You slowly move through Wally's life, his romancing of Eva, and like you kind of learn more and more about him as you go. And then all of a sudden, the second half, all that kind of gets put to the side, and we have this story to tell you. And I honestly think that it's kind of a trap that a lot of people fall into when they're trying to make an artistic movie versus a crowd-pleasing movie. And you kind of end up doing both. Mm-hmm. And you always wonder, like, well, what could have been if you just stuck to the artistic bent, or what could have been if you just stuck to the storytelling bent, the crowd-pleasing bent?
Yeah.
Because I think that the story that they tell is, it's a crowd pleaser. It's good. It's a story of triumph over gluttony and consumerism and all the things that they triumph over.
Right.
But like you said, I do think you have a valid point here in saying that the beauty of the first half, you only get a bit of it in the second half when, Wally has the fire extinguisher and him and Ava. Why do I keep saying Ava?
Well,
man?
First of all, her name is actually Eve, but Wally can't pronounce it. And so every time he says it, he says Eva. But her name's
way freaking
Eve.
cuter.
It's
It's
cuter.
way freaking cuter.
It's cuter
to say Eva.
Okay.
So
say whatever you want, man.
So
it's your show, dude.
So Eve, when she's flying with him, it's just like adorable and beautiful. But you don't get a ton of that in the second half.
But
so I'm with you, man.
Brad, like, I don't know if you got the metaphor, but her name is Eve because she's like the first female of this new world that they come back to.
What?
Do you get it?
No, I actually don't, Bob. Can you explain it to me?
I can't. I didn't get it either. It was way over my head.
Oh, okay.
All right, cool.
Yeah, it's not like I have a, seminary degree in like Christianity or anything.
No, not at all.
Otto, things have changed. We've got to go back.
Sir, orders are, do not return to Earth.
But life is sustainable now. Look at this plant. Green and growing. It's living proof he was wrong.
Irrelevant, Captain.
What? It's completely relevant. Out there is our home. Home, Otto. And it's in trouble. I can't just sit here and do nothing. That's all I've ever done. That's all anyone in this blasted ship has ever done. Nothing.
On the Axiom, you will survive.
I don't want to survive. I want to live.
Must follow my directive.
Ah!
So I kind of want to drill down before we go to break, Brad, on this idea of why do critics love this movie so much? And we've basically already said it, but I think I want to make it explicit here. When you look at people's lists of best Pixar movie that are like, paid movie critics, people who watch these things for a living, who have seen thousands of movies over the course of their lives, they put Wall-E at number one more often than not. And I think it's because at the end of the day, and I don't want to be reductionistic, but like, I think a lot of times what critics are looking for is something new and something that is this idea of being like a purely cinematic experience. This idea that like the story that's being told is being told through the medium of film in a way that only the medium of film could tell the story. if that makes sense. And sometimes that means like, hey, it's a hell of a good time. It's, Steven Spielberg making these gigantic dinosaurs, and there's a popcorn element to it, but it's also like the artistry and the craft behind it is really apparent. I think when they watch this movie, what they hone in on, critics that is that first half, which is they made a silent movie about a futuristic robot, and there are no humans in the first part of the movie except what you see on a video screen. And yet they're telling this incredibly complex story about pollution and, like you said, consumerism, all that stuff. And it's a love story. And I think they really latch onto that as this achievement in cinematic storytelling. And they just like vaulted up to number one. But I think, Brad, again, for me, we touched on this in Toy Story 2 a little bit, that in its later years, Pixar has really tipped into how can we tell a really deep, meaningful story for adults? And it kind of has seemed like it's at the expense of how do we keep kids engaged in this movie and entertained by this movie? And I think WALL-E as a character is cute enough that kids go along for the ride. But I watched this movie the other night with my 4-year-old, and he was engaged the whole time. He enjoyed the movie, but I could tell 90% of what the movie's about went over his head. And I think this may have been the first movie that Pixar made that there was a conscious decision behind the scenes that they made, which was like, all right, maybe this is a movie for 10-year-olds as opposed to 5-year-olds. Maybe this is a movie for 13-year-olds and people who are finally starting to get into high school or whatever, and older than that. And that's totally fine. But I think this was the first time I really felt the imbalance between the deeper themes they wanted to explore and the intended target audience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Bob, I'm sitting here on Rotten Tomatoes right now, and I will say it has a 95% critic score and a 90% audience score. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's a massive difference there, but it's interesting because the critic consensus says WALL-E's stellar visuals testify once again to Pixar's ingenuity, while its charming star will captivate younger viewers. And so even that little summary right there is pointing out what you're saying of like, yep, it's beautiful and it'll capture adults with that. And its, main star, WALL-E, is cute, so younger viewers will watch that.
Right.
And they're pointing to this divide between, the adults watching the film and the kids watching the film. And I'm sure Pixar was okay with that at a certain point.
Now, I will say, again, visually, this is one of the most incredible animated films I've ever seen. And I, to the critics' credit, that first half of the movie is, it's an insane accomplishment. Everything that you learn about this world that WALL-E is inhabiting, you learn through silent storytelling, and you learn it through where the camera is placed. This was
no, Bob. Don't forget Fred Willard.
I'll get around to Fred. But one thing I really noticed this time around, Brad, is the way that they were mimicking kind of like the shaky cam fad that we went through in the mid 2000s to the later 2000s. There's a lot of zoom lenses going on in this movie. There's a lot of WALL-E is riding himself across a landscape, and the camera will whip pan all the way over to WALL-E and then zoom in on something. And there were a lot of points where I forgot that they didn't actually film this movie with a camera. They are training a computer to mimic a camera move that, a human would be making while holding it with his hands or her hands. It's these extra steps that are super mind-blowing that they're actually training a computer to mimic the imperfections of a human operating a camera. And they do it so well that you're thinking to yourself as you're watching it, oh yeah, it's a shaky cam because the person must have been shaking while they were running after WALL-E. And then you're like, wait a minute, there is no person. And I think it's just an AI. This is the first time I think that you really started to notice, oh, I didn't realize Pixar could even do that with their animation.
Yeah, the ability to take traditional animation, think outside the box and go, man, can we make it look like a real camera? This is actually being filmed? It's pure innovation. Mm-hmm. It's stuff like that, which is why I think the bar is just set so high for Pixar and why it's so hard for them to make like smash hits anymore because people have seen their stuff and they're like, well, the bar is this high, so you better hit it.
All right, before we go to break, I want to get real quick, Brad. Too much, too little, or just the right amount of Hello Dolly in this movie?
It got a little old.
It's a little much, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a little much.
It's a little much. And listen.
Like the first time he has that little hubcap and he's like hitting his head with it
he's
and doing the
put on
dance.
your Sunday clothes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. But by the end of it's a little bit much.
Listen, I was over it before they went to space because they play Put On Your Sunday Clothes probably 4 times. And they play the other song, It Only Takes a Moment, probably 4 times. And then they go to space and they play each song again at like 4 different points. And after a certain point, I was like, I love Hello Dolly. Like I was in the musical in high school. It's a fun musical. The songs are incredible. It was enough. And I was saying to my television, like, please no more Hello Dolly, please. And they just kept coming with it. It was almost as annoying to me as the number of near-death experiences Wally had in this movie.
Bro, that dude is making it through the apocalypse. Like, you thought that little roach thing following him around could survive anything? Man, Wally can just do it all.
I think that was a complaint we had with Finding Nemo, and they kind of replicated it here, which was anytime they needed some sort of stakes in the second half of the movie, it was just like, let's kill Wally. And then let's bring him back again. And then we'll kill him again. And then we'll bring him back again.
It's wild. Do you know who directed Finding Nemo?
Andrew Stanton.
It was Andrew Stanton.
He's kind of a one-trick pony here. Let's just repeatedly murder our main character and see if it keeps working.
Yeah. I mean, why not?
Let that be a lesson to you filmmakers out there. Why not? Just keep murdering your character and bringing them back.
Yeah. Just keep throwing stuff against the wall. You never know when it'll stick.
And by throwing stuff against the wall, we mean throw your main character against the wall.
Many
until
times.
He's dead. Yeah, right.
It'll be like Loki in the first Avengers.
All right, Brad, what do you say we hit pause here? Let's try this Old Forester 150.
Dude, I am really pumped for this. Let's go.
All right, so today we are checking out Old Forester 150, and by that I mean Old Forester 150th Anniversary. Now, this was a special release that came out last year, 2020. The story behind it is it was intended to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Old Forester and its founder, George Garvin Brown, and the 150th anniversary of bottling whiskey. This was a huge innovation at the time. And so they took 150 barrels. They were going to do 150 barrels for this 150th anniversary, and they were going to sell it at $150 a bottle. So it's a pricey, very exclusive bourbon that we're drinking here today. What they ended up finding was that 3 of the 150 barrels were completely lost to evaporation. So, the narrative kind of broke down a little bit because they only ended up with 147 barrels. But Jackie basically sampled all the barrels and made 3 batches out of them that each have their own unique flavor profile. The one that we're trying today, Brad, is batch 1. Now, Brad, batch 1 comes in at 125.6 proof, and it's made up of 46 of those 147 barrels. I'm not going to say much more, man. This is an incredibly rare, incredibly exclusive whiskey that we are trying courtesy of our friends at Crafted Cocktail Company, our favorite cocktail bar in Wadsworth, Ohio. So first of all, thank you to Crafted Cocktail for allowing us to sample this. Brad, I say we just jump in, man. What are you picking up on the nose of this Old Forester 150?
Bob, this bad boy has all sorts of like dark cherry. There's leather notes. There's a little bit of burnt caramel. It's got a lot of heat coming off of the nose. I am just loving the complexity here. I think it's an 8.5 out of 10 for me.
Yeah, the note that I took down was that this was a shapeshifter. Like, I wish we had paired this with some sort of alien movie and not just a space movie, because this would have gone really well with something that can take the form of something else. When I poured this out, like, I immediately gave it a nosing, and it started out for me as a really ripe banana. Then I was like, oh, this is nice. I set it down. I came back to it like a minute later, and the banana was gone, but it was like super intense cinnamon. And then I came back to it another minute later. I was letting it kind of open up a little bit. It was double bubble gum. And then the last thing I got was apple peel. Like, specifically, it smelled like a red delicious apple. So it was, I don't want to say it was all over the place as much as it was like, it went in very specific waves for me. Super complex on the nose, Brad. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but it was like, I don't know where it's going to go on the taste, but I can tell a lot of care went into crafting this. And I think that's why I'm going to give it a 9.5 on the nose.
Bob, I'm pretty sure you have a dartboard where every spot on the board just has like a different tasting note. And you just threw like 4 darts at the same time. You're like, double bubble, apple.
More accurately, this whiskey threw darts at my nose.
It did. No, yeah, I'm right there with you, Bob. This is a really complex nose. For me, it kind of stayed in the darker areas with that like cherry and leather and a little bit of like, it wasn't like normal caramel. Like it kind of smelled like a burnt caramel. I really enjoyed this nose a lot. And as I jumped into the actual palate, holy crap, dude. It was like a cherry cordial with some brown sugar. There was some spicy rye notes going on here. This thing is just out of this world delicious. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the taste.
Yeah, this was a really, like, the first note I took down was that it's really warm and the flavors are very rounded, like well-rounded flavors for me. Lots of caramel. Brad, you're right. Tons of brown sugar and cherry cola. Like, for me, it wasn't so much a cherry cordial. It was like a cherry Coke, essentially. But I did get a little bit of that bubble gum on the very end of it, and I did get a little bit of that red delicious apple peel. Like, I'm really glad that some of those notes carried over from the nose. And I mean, it isn't hard because I just listed like 100 things that were on the nose, but there is a lot of consistency here on the palate from what we had on the nose. I do think the taste is just the slightest step down from the nose for me, but man, this is still, I don't know how else to phrase it, Brad, except to say that this is more complex than like 99% of the whiskeys we've ever had, right? Like, it is immediately in my mind, I am comparing this against some of the best whiskeys we've ever had, just because those also tend to be the ones that have the most going on in them. So I'm going to give this an 8.5 on the taste, but man, this is really like, it's a heavy hitter.
Yeah, Bob, honestly, the complexity on this whiskey, I feel like the only other one that we've drank that came close to it is the Thomas H. Handy Sazerac that we drank a year ago now. I don't remember when.
Yeah.
That's the only other whiskey that I think is as complex as what we're getting here. And yeah, I mean, it's phenomenal. When I get to the finish, I think it really settles in kind of deep in your chest with these leather. There's really heavy oak flavors, and they just linger for such a long time. I'm getting a little bit of tobacco as it finishes. I just think that it just keeps getting better and better as it goes. I'm going to stick with a 9 out of 10 on the finish.
Yeah, I mean, this one, when it gets to the finish, I think is when it really announces itself as an Old Forester product. For me, like, Old Forester, the baseline bourbon has always been really oak forward and really spicy. Like, if you're not into a whiskey that kind of kicks you in the pants a little bit, like, Old Forester might not be for you. And I think this one, it definitely has some of that spicy, like, spikiness to it. But at the same time, I wouldn't call it harsh in any way. Like, it really has a nice warming sensation as it goes down, but it's not astringent in any way. It's not one of those ones that you feel like you have to chase with water immediately. And we're talking a whiskey that's in the 120s in terms of proof points, but I think it's a really, really nice drinker at that proof point. Once again, I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10 on the finish.
And that takes us to our balance, which, I mean, for me, these are incredibly complex flavors that are mixing for a phenomenal experience. Like, it's one thing when you have a lot of different flavors and it just doesn't work. It's just an okay whiskey. But when you can mix all of these diverse flavor profiles into a whiskey that has a nice Kentucky hug, it moves from nose to palate to finish really smoothly. I think that the balance is one of the best whiskeys we've ever had. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm also going to give it a 9.5. I think that especially among the Old Forester products we've had on this show so far, this is the best balanced one of all of them. It is definitely still in the Old Forester wheelhouse, but this one is operating at a level that I don't think we've ever seen before in terms of the complexity here. Like, this is 50 times better than the birthday bourbon we had. I would say this is 5 to 10 times better than the single barrel rye we just had when Jackie was on the show. Brad, this is approaching that upper echelon of 5 best whiskeys we've ever had on the show, I would say. And you're right. The only thing I can really think to compare it to is something from a BTAC line or a Pappy Van Winkle, which, Brad, you and I have now been lucky enough to try Pappy. I think the only difference here that I see in this whiskey to a BTAC or to a Pappy Van Winkle is that when I drink the BTAC, when I drink the Van Winkle, there's it's like eating a really rich piece of cake where, you can only really sip a little bit at a time and you're like, all right, that's enough. Like it's just really dense and really oily, especially the Pappy was like that. The BTAC that we had, I think, was immediately like, oh, there's a lot going on here. This one, I think you can trick yourself into just thinking, oh, this is a really nice Old Forester. And then after you kind of let it sit in your mouth for a minute, you're like, oh, wait a minute. This is not your average Old Forester. And I think this one really sneaks up on you a little bit. And I think that's why I am a little disappointed in where it's at in terms of market value right now. Because when I initially tried this, you could still get a bottle of the 150. Now, again, this was never intended to be something that they were going to continue to produce. Like, it's a limited edition, so the prices are going to go sky high once everyone's had a chance at it. But at $150, Brad, I would have given this like a 9.5 out of 10 on value. Like, I think if you're going to splurge on a bottle, let it be a bottle like this. Unfortunately, now that all the bottles have been bought up and everyone's selling them on the secondary market, the cheapest I can find a bottle of this online looked to be about $599. And that's about the same as we were talking when we did the BTAC at the end of last season. So I guess, Brad, unfortunately, I want us to give scores at retail value, but all the retail's been bought up at this point. So we really kind of only have to score this based on a $600 price tag. And it's unfair, but if you want it, that's the asking price at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it difficult. For me, at $150, I think I'd give this like an 8 out of 10 on value. At $600, I guess it's hard for me, Bob, because once you get into that echelon of whiskey, there's just not many casual or even amateur whiskey drinkers out there that are going to splurge for that. And so the only people who are buying it are either groups of people going in together and spending like $80 each, or it's, rich people that, can sneeze out that much money. So I have a hard time evaluating whiskeys once they get above $300-$400. If it's me paying it, I'm not going to buy it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You take that score, that and give it a score.
Quantify it somehow. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking if I go back to Crafted Cocktail, Scott, our buddy there, probably bought a bottle of this when it was around $150 and it's been sitting on the shelf. And I imagine that, they priced out a pour of this based on the $150 price tag, not based on what it currently is. So let's just say, Brad, that even with the insane markup you might pay at a cocktail bar, if this is going for $30 an ounce, I still think it's worth it. And I still think it's really, really worth it. So I'm going to go ahead and just give it a 7 out of 10 on value. I think there are a lot of ways you could try this whiskey without having to pay $600. And to try it, even if you're going to splurge a little bit just for a sample of it, I think is worth it. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I'll stick with my 8 out of 10. And Bob, that takes me out to a 44 out of 50. It's not quite a 90 out of 100 for me, mostly because of the price that you're paying. If you just left it at a score out of 40, I think I'd be at a 36 out of 40.
Yeah.
So this is a heck of a whiskey that you're getting here.
Yeah, I came out to a 43 out of 50, Brad. So our average score takes us to a 43.5 or an 87 out of 100. This is easily in the top 5 whiskeys we have ever had on this podcast, if you can find a sample of Old Forester 150th. Now, again, our sample was from batch 1, but there are 2 other batches out there that you could sample. It is one of the easiest recommendations I think I've ever given on this podcast, Brad.
Yeah, 100%. Go get some.
All right, well, thank you again to Crafted Cocktail for this sample. Brad, let's get back into talking about Wally.
Yeah, let's get to it.
All right, that was Old Forester 150th anniversary, and it was damn good whiskey.
It is so good.
We're getting back into talking about Wall-E, and Brad, I'm told that you have a Brad G Award to give out for this movie.
Yeah, did our producer of the show just like buzz into your ear and tell you?
He did.
Oh, by the way.
You got to throw to the award, man.
Come on, Bob. Didn't you read the notes? Yeah, I do have an award, and that award would be the most obvious reference to 2001: A Space Odyssey ever made in a film.
What is it when the fat captain finally stands up at the end?
I mean, everything. It's the AI robot. It's the ship captain like taking step by step as the horns are blasting.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
I don't know if you noticed, but they also played that classical piece. I think it's called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. They played that in Toy Story 2 as well at the very beginning when Buzz was hopping across the little things to get to Emperor Zurg. So,
yeah, that to me, that reference in Toy Story 2 was a little bit more subtle. Like you didn't have a robot with a red eye like trying to sabotage humanity.
Right.
And you didn't have like a human trying to destroy that robot. It just kind of felt a little on the nose for me.
Go back to our conversation in the first half about how, the first part of the movie seems very like art film and the second part of the movie is very much a crowd pleaser. I wonder like if Wall-E had hopped on the side of that spaceship and then when he went up into space, they just played the ending of 2001. Would it have been a more cohesive movie?
Dude, I can just see somebody splicing like Wall-E on the rocket ship and they're just like floating through space and you just see the giant space baby.
Just a fetus.
like staring at him.
Bye, buddy. Hope you find your dad.
Yeah. And Wall-E's just like, Eva.
Oh, man. Why have we not made that movie?
Oh, man, it needs to happen. The film and whiskey cut.
So, Brad, I want to know, as we kind of wind down for the day, where would this rank in your Pixar ranking? Like, obviously, I don't need you to rank. I think there's been 21 or 22 Pixar movies now. You don't have to rank them all, but is this approaching that upper echelon for you? Is it kind of in that second tier? Where would you put this movie? Because I've already said, I think I appreciate it more than I enjoy it. But it sounds like you really got a lot of enjoyment out of this movie.
Yeah, I did. I think, like I said at the start of the episode, it definitely has a strong political message. But in the end, like, it's a beautiful movie. It's well scripted. And obviously the script is so much more than just the dialogue. Like, the way that they follow Wall-E, the way that they introduced Eva into the movie, the style of pretty much the whole movie, I think is just so well done. For me, I really do think this is upper echelon Pixar. I think it represents a jump into the future of animation. that Pixar does time and time again with their first movie. I think they did it again with something like Monsters, Inc. And then, with something like WALL-E, you just see them pushing the boundaries of what animation can do. And so, yeah, I don't know if I'd say it's a top Pixar movie, but I would put it in a top 4 or 5 Pixar movies for sure.
Okay. Yeah, see, for me, I think that I really do have a huge appreciation for those movies like Toy Story 2 that find the balance between a 4-year-old can appreciate the silliness of this and a 40-year-old can appreciate like the deeper existential things we're doing. And so I think Toy Story 2 and Finding Nemo and Monsters, Inc., for me, and even Toy Story 3 to some extent, those are the ones that I don't think will ever be topped. And I think I'd probably put Ratatouille in that group as well in like my top 5. I think this would probably be somewhere between 5 and 10. Like it's in the second tier for me, but it's definitely, I mean, it's better than 99% of the animated movies that come out every year. It's just not like, it's not one that has captured my heart in a way that some of the other ones have. And I think that takes me to my final score. I look at this movie, Brad, it's only an hour and a half long. It's a pretty lean movie. And yet I think that because they spend the first 35-ish minutes on Earth in this cute little love story, that when they get to space, everything in space seems less consequential to like the plot. And so by the end of the movie, when they are really racing against the clock and trying to help the captain defeat the autopilot, every time they cut back to what's going on in the captain's quarters, it never seems to carry the same weight as what we know is the real story, which is WALL-E trying to get back to this robot that he loves in Eve. They take a turn into it being almost like this 1970s spy thriller kind of thing. It feels almost like at the end where you realize there's a conspiracy and they've been hiding things from the captain. And I really loved some of the ideas they were going for, but I felt like they didn't take the time to flesh them out enough to make them really feel impactful. And that even extends, I think, to the message about pollution and about consumerism. There were these really interesting ideas throughout the movie that they kept hinting at, like WALL-E would drive by a room full of children who were learning the ABCs, and the ABCs were, brought to you by and Large. And I was like, oh man, like spend 10 more seconds here. Like just make the point a little bit more so that it doesn't just seem like window dressing on this movie. And I think that they're hinting at some really good, really deep philosophical questions that they just ultimately never really have the balls to dive headfirst into. And I think that's part of why, like, the political messages of the movie and the idea, the conservation message of the movie, it's all good. Like, it's a good message to promote, but it's not the point of the movie, because the point of the movie they've built up is this love story. And so it's like, well, if you want to have this be a message movie, then spend more time on the message. And so I think that's where, for me, WALL-E just slips a little bit down that list of Pixar movies. It's a really good movie. It's just not quite as cohesive as some of those other Pixar movies. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10, Brad.
Bob, you just gave this detailed, like, thrashing of the movie and came out to the exact same score that I'm at.
Boom.
I'm like, yeah, 8.5 out of 10. This is good. I think that Pixar hits on so many different things in this movie, but you pointed out a lot of good things there. Like the story, the message of the story gets lost. Are we supposed to just care about this cute little robot? Are we supposed to care about, global warming and pollution and consumerism? What's really going on here? And I think that really detracts from the movie for me, because outside of that, man, I just think that they knocked it out of the park with so many things in this movie. But whoever wrote the actual story itself, it feels like it just kind of got tacked on. And that's unfortunate, because they were really onto something in this film.
All right, so that's where we're coming out on WALL-E. We're both at an 8.5 out of 10, but we want to know what you think. So please reach out to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or tell us what you think. Let your voice be heard on the Film and Whiskey podcast. You can do that by calling us on our website, which is anchor.fm/, you guessed it, Film Whiskey.
We'll be back next week talking about the Best Picture winner of the year 2000, Ridley Scott's Roman swords and sandals epic, Gladiator. Join us for that next week, but until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.